Welcome back to Module 10 on Lifecycle Manager. We're going to have a look at the new Lifecycle Manager feature of working with images, and that is creating your own custom image for the hosts in your clusters that are running vSphere 7. We'll describe what an ESXi image is, and then we'll import into Lifecycle Manager ESXi updates. We'll then enable Lifecycle Manager images for a cluster, and then define an image for that cluster. So we'll build our own custom images. We then have to validate that the image that we've built is valid for that particular cluster and the hardware that it's running in. Then we'll learn how to update our ESXi hosts using Lifecycle Manager. And then we'll have a cool feature that allows us to apply one of VMware's recommended images to the hosts in your cluster. So we'll show you how that works too. It's a really neat new feature. When working with images, we are going to create our own custom image for ESXi that we're going to apply across all of the hosts in your cluster. So what actually is an image here? Well, it's the ESXi software that runs on your hosts. And it starts off with a base image that comes from VMware. This is your entire ESXi infrastructure here, with the exception of anything that you would like to add. Now, one of the things that you can add are what's called a component. And this is the base element of a piece of software that we can install in ESXi. Typically, this might be a little patch. It might be a driver. It comes in the form of a vSphere infrastructure bundle, or a VIB, that is zipped up for us in a zip file. Okay? This is the base element that you can include in an ESXi image. So when I choose to build an image depot, it will include a base image. It will then optionally include any components that I want to add, any vendor add-on components that will come from third-party vendors, as well as any firmware and drivers add-ons that will come from vendors that are working very closely with VMware to allow us to actually commit firmware updates to the physical hardware. Currently, as of May of 2020, this is HP and Dell. Okay? HP OpenView and Dell's OpenManage, I think, is the software components that we have here. So we interface with those, and they interface with us. And so as time goes on, other third-party hardware manufacturers will integrate this software so that you can update your firmware and drivers directly from ESXi as well. So we're going to start by building our image depot. Okay? Under Image Depot, you can see here, there are 3 different components that we can add. We can add ESXi versions. In this case, we have ESXi 7.0 GA. And we can see all of the different components that are included in ESXi. But we can then also add vendor add-ons as well as other individual components. Now, how do we import updates into this? Well, we do this from the Actions menu, where we can synchronize updates from VMware's software depots from online. We can import updates by pointing to a URL or adding a zip file. And we can also synchronize vCenter Server's Lifecycle Manager database with VMware's hardware compatibility list, so that we can ensure that based on the hardware you're running, whatever software that you'd like to include in your image is actually going to be compatible with that particular version, with that particular hardware component. At this point, as we continue to add all of these images, we've created now this baseline, or we have the ability to create this baseline. But before we do that, we have to tell Lifecycle Manager that we would like to begin managing a cluster using images, using a single image as opposed to baselines. Okay? Now, in order to do this, you're going to go ahead and select your cluster, go to Updates, And then you'll find that you are currently managing your cluster with baselines. Clicking this button allows us to manage with a single image. Now here's the thing. Once you choose this, you cannot go back. You'd have to destroy the cluster and build your cluster and import the hosts over again. All of our hosts have to be at least ESXi 7, and they all have to be statefully installed, which means this does not support auto deploy using PXE booted or network booted ESXi hosts. Stateless installs, okay? Ideally, all of the hosts that are in the cluster should be from the same vendor, and they should really be the same model so that we can ensure that the same version of ESXi and the same version of all the drivers and all of the other components that we add will be compatible with all of the hardware in the cluster itself. At this point, we can select to manage with a single image and run through the creation of our images. So creating an image for a cluster can be done in a couple of ways. It can be done when you set up the cluster initially. Okay? You remember when we had this new cluster wizard and we could choose DRS and HA and vSAN, and we could hit this checkbox that says, let's manage all of the hosts with a single cluster image. And it says what version of ESXi, and are there any vendor add-ons that you would like to add? The interesting thing about this, about doing it through this wizard, is that it doesn't give you a complete list of all of the different things that you can add to this custom image. It doesn't give you the option of doing firmware, and it doesn't give you the option of more than of other manual components. It only gives you the option of an ESXi version and a single vendor add-on. But it does say, hey, you can customize this image a little bit later. Okay. The other way to do it is through Lifecycle Manager. You can hit the button that says New Image, right? And it'll go through and allow you to select all of these different components, which you can then check your cluster against. So here, I'm going to find my cluster, go to Updates, and then select Images, and then check Compliance. In this case, my cluster only has one host that is out of compliance with the image, ESXi 03 here. So my image includes ESXi and a component here, which is a test component that we added, okay? And it says we're out of compliance, and I can check for compliance. It says nope. Then I'll hit the button that says remediate. Before I remediate, I might want to run a pre-check, and the pre-check will tell me whether or not this remediation will be successful. Here it says, I've got an issue in the cluster, and it's a vSAN cluster, and it says the vSAN hardware compatibility database is not up to date. So check this in vSAN, okay? So especially when you have vSAN, vSAN and the hardware compatibility list are absolutely critical. You've got to be updated with the hardware compatibility list, because hardware compatibility for vSAN, especially when it comes to things like storage controllers, is absolutely critical there. So we do a double check against the vSAN hardware compatibility list. And if that's not up to date within vCenter, then it'll warn you. It's just a warning. You can proceed if you like. It will also check the other hardware compatibility. And in this case, we're only checking against vSAN storage controllers and not with the full hardware compatibility guide. So that's where we are today, really concerned with vSAN storage controllers for the most part here. And it says this image has 2 compatibility issues. This is, by the way, is done from my home lab, where I have some Samsung NVMe devices in my hosts. And it says, sorry, the current controller firmware on these NVMe devices, this controller, this is the SM961 and PM961, which is present on 2 hosts, and this other controller, which is present on 4 hosts, are not compatible with the ESXi hardware compatibility list, so there is an issue here. You might want to do something about it. In this case, I need to go to Samsung and try to get some firmware that is compatible with ESXi. And that's probably what you'll likely do when it comes to controller updates, okay? You'll do that kind of out of band of this, and then you can come back. Now here's something that's interesting. All of the software that you will now run in ESXi must be managed through Lifecycle Manager. If you have a hardware component that you had manually installed in ESXi previously, that hardware component needs to be ripped out and replaced through Lifecycle Manager. So when you convert a host or cluster that had been previously updated manually, that included standalone VIB files, and I did have some on my host, okay? Those need to be ripped out and re-added as components to your image, okay? And when you do this, it's going to ask you a couple of things. Do you want to not convert to images, stay with the baselines, or do you want to allow Image Depot or the Lifecycle Manager to rip out that VIB, which you can then manually import back in if you like? Now I have the ability to remediate my cluster against an image. And remember, that image is going to include, by default, obviously it has to have an ESXi image itself that comes from VMware, but then it can also add optional hardware vendor add-ons, firmware and driver add-ons, and any user-specified components that I'd like to manually add, okay? We can then, as we remediate, all of the software that's included in the image gets copied down to the ESXi host, and that's the version of ESXi that you've custom built and will be running on your hosts. You can remediate against a single host in a cluster or to the entire cluster, okay? You could also just do a check against the hosts, a pre-check against the hosts, without doing a remediation if that's something that you want to do. Once you hit the remediate button, there will be an impact report that's given to you. And the impact or remediation report tells you what's going to happen during the update. Are there any settings that need to be changed, or it'll tell you exactly what's going to happen. It'll tell you that admission control is going to be disabled and things like that. You then accept the end user license agreement, and it'll give you any impact to specific hosts, okay? And it says that the hosts will be remediated in a particular order and so on, okay? Once the pre-check is complete, you have the option of either stopping at that point or hitting the Start Remediation button, and your hosts at that point will be patched and remediated to your cluster image. Now here's a really cool thing, and it's called Recommended Images. And it will take your ESXi host and compare it against VMware's database of recommended images for that host. This will be particularly applicable as VMware introduces updates to vSphere 7, okay? Or even upgrades, later versions, 7.x, 8.x, vSphere.next, whatever it might be, okay? So when you select an image after you've built it, you have a couple of options. You can edit the image, or by clicking the ellipses here, you can export the image, bring it into another Lifecycle Manager through vCenter, import that image, or check for recommended images here. At this point, what it's going to give you is a list of recommended images. Now, we don't have anything in the database right now for recommended images because the current version of ESXi is the recommended version of ESXi, and it's the only one that's supported with Lifecycle Manager images. So it'll tell you, here's the current version of ESXi. Here is the latest version of ESXi in the series. In this case, vSphere 7 Update 5, which doesn't actually exist. This is just a mock-up, right? But at some point, Update 1 will be available, and it'll say your current image is 7.0, the current version of 7 is 7.0 Update 1, and the latest and greatest version at some point in the future will also be listed here. And it will give you an opportunity at this point to update to the latest and greatest version of vSphere. So this is a nice thing that says, hey, you know what, I'm not keeping currently, up to date with all the vSphere blogs and all that kind of stuff. And vSphere, if I check this periodically, it'll let me know that VMware has a major update available for ESXi or a major upgrade for vSphere available for me. It's a really nice new feature there. I can then select a recommended image. I can then save that as a cluster image and add other components to it, and that'll be my new image that I can remediate my hosts against. Yep. Of course, customizing my cluster images, okay, it goes kind of like we've been saying. So finally, we've got an image. There's an ESXi version that we've selected, and it's showing me that I haven't added any vendor add-ons or any firmware or driver add-ons or any other additional components. But if I hit the edit button, I can actually select vendor add-ons, firmware components, or other components that I can then import with one another. Okay? When I hit the validate button, it will ensure that anything that I've added to this, vendor add-ons, firmware components, are compatible with the current ESXi base image, with the ESXi version. If, for example, I took an old driver that wasn't compatible with 7.0 and tried to add it, the validate button will say, I'm sorry, this VIB that you're trying to add, this zip file, contains a driver that's compatible with 6.7, but it hasn't been validated against 7.0. We're not going to allow you to apply it to this particular image. Okay? So that validation is really important. It will also ensure that any dependencies for a particular VIB are also met. Inside a VIB file, it includes metadata that says, here's the versions of ESXi I'm compatible with, here's the versions of ESXi that I'm not compatible with, and here are the other VIBs that I am relying upon. Make sure those other VIBs are there before you install this VIB. So if other VIBs need to be added, or if an ESXi host needs to be checked to ensure that that software is there, it'll do that part. Well, let's test this. Let's dive into the lab number 27, using vSphere Lifecycle Manager, where we will import some files to an image depot and create our cluster image. Okay? We'll then add some hosts to the cluster and apply that cluster image to our cluster itself. And that, of course, does it for this particular lesson on Lifecycle Manager using images, where we understand now what an ESXi image is. We're able to create ESXi images, validate them against the cluster, and then finally apply those images to the cluster, updating the entire cluster's ESXi images for all of the hosts. I hope you've enjoyed this. And when we come back, we're going to have one more lesson in the class where we're going to learn how to update VMware tools as well as virtual hardware versions. Okay? Talk to you real soon.